Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to speak to this important conference again, and I congratulate you once again for putting together an outstanding agenda. The topic that I am going to briefly talk about is the new development pattern and its relevance for global industrial and supply chain cooperation. This is a very important topic today, especially since we are in the midst of a very significant global supply shock. And this is not the first time we've been through something like this, and yet it is a important and potentially worrisome development if we don't move together in a cooperative way to address this. In some respects, what we're going through today is very much like the supply shock of the early 1970s. I'm old enough to have been a working economist during that earlier period, working actually at America's central bank, the Federal Reserve Board, having just received my PhD in economics in 1972. And so I remember this earlier supply shock quite well. And there are some striking similarities with what we're going through today. Back then, as there is today, there were widespread shortages of materials and components. There were also very serious shipping delays. There were labor shortages, and there were wage pressures. And the inflation rate had started to rise very sharply. And then, another striking similarity is that the central bank in the United States, the Federal Reserve Board, was really in denial as to the severity of the problem. Back in the 1970s, as is the case today, the America's central bank thought the supply disruptions and the price pressures that were occurring as a result of that were transitory. They would only last for a little bit and then magically go away. And of course, that was not the case back then. And there are many people, myself included, who is concerned that will once again be the case today, that this is not a transitory development. While there are some similarities, there are also a lot of differences, and they're very important between today and the global supply shock of the early 1970s. First and foremost, and to the point of my remarks to you today, we have new global supply chains that were not operative in the early 1970s. These global value chains really provide a new technology of production and assembly that we did not have the ability to achieve in the early 70s. And so as a result, today the global economy and the production platform that underpins the global economy is much more tightly integrated than it was in the early 70s. Today we also have, as a result, a much more efficient way of producing goods, and it largely follows a model that we discovered in the late 1980s from the Japanese, the just-in-time management and inventory control procedures that were very important to the Japanese economy and its successes in the 80s and 90s, and now have played a key role in leading to the development of the efficiencies of global value chains. What's also very different, though, is the shock today, largely traceable to COVID-19, is actually much more severe than the shocks that we experienced in the 1970s. Those were difficult shocks. We had an OPEC shock that reflected an embargo of oil deliveries to the United States following the Israeli-Arab War of 1973. That was very disruptive, and the price of oil shot up as a result. And that was a big shock. But the COVID shock today is far more severe, and the economies around the world plunged much more sharply than they did in the early 70s. And once the lockdowns were lifted, the rebounds have been far more dramatic today than they were back then. And one other important difference, finally, is monetary policy. We made some mistakes in monetary policy in the early 1970s that we're determined not to make today. And those are important lessons. But one thing that we really need to think about very carefully is that we have new tools of monetary policy that were not in existence in the early 1970s. The balance sheet, asset purchases, quantitative easing, these have played an important role in the design and strategy of monetary policy, and it's largely uncertain as to how effective they will be in addressing this global supply shock. So, having examined the similarities and the differences with the early 1970s, let me just address the final point, and that is how can we come to a more cooperative solution to address disruptions to global production and supply chains. Well, cooperation, of course, is great in theory. The hard thing is to put it into practice. And that's especially true because cooperation is undermined by this growing tendency toward protectionism, which has led to, for many, especially in the United States, to argue for something called reshoring, which is the opposite of offshoring that occurs in global value chains. And we've also found that the lack of slack in our global supply chains makes cooperation very difficult. So I would like to just close with what I think is a realistic set of items, an agenda for action, collaborative action in addressing the new development patterns in an era of global supply disruption. And I want to make 3 points. One, it's important to improve the transparency in the way in which we manage global value chains. And by that, I mean to recognize that these value chains are global in scope, and we need to assemble global information that gives us a sense of the status of global supply chains in major economies around the world. And to better implement that, I think we need to have global collaboration in producing data-based information systems that give us supply chain status by stages of production, from the raw material to the intermediate assembly to the distribution of final goods stages. And that information needs to be available to all major users of supply chains around the world. Secondly, I think we need to face up to the fact that we've taken too much slack out of global supply chains. So when something goes wrong, we have immediate repercussions in terms of shortages and price pressures. We need to build more slack into global supply chains, give us a greater margin for error. And third and finally, and to my earlier point, we must end this practice of weaponizing global supply chains, which has become a very unfortunate outgrowth of this increasingly protectionist era. So we need to bring an end to trade wars, to protectionism, and that especially applies to the current trade conflict between the United States and China. The sooner we can bring this conflict to an end, the better the opportunity for more proactive, collaborative efforts in addressing supply chain issues around the world. Again, I want to congratulate you for an outstanding conference, and I want to thank you very much for the opportunity to present my views to you again this year.